Chapter 23, The Trees. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Revelation. Now what was the matter with her? Seward asked herself when she got back home. She hadn't felt so bad since Porteous ran around with that other woman. Even then she didn't know, as she was so short-tempered, sharp-spoken, and mean. Nothing suited her any more. She should have thanked the Lord every night for getting her back safe and sound, and having a decent home to come to. On the whole trip, she hadn't seen a house she'd want to trade for hers. What was that old saying? Travel north, south, east, west, home's best. That was a true saying. And yet here she was, fretting, grumbling about everything around home, especially about higher taxes. Americus was getting too big for its britches, she complained. Why, the numbered streets ran high as 14th already, and some were talking of them going to 20. The town wasn't satisfied with milling, blacksmithing, and wheelwrighting any more, but had to brag now about its new soap works, that packed pork and beef, its looking-glass works that made combs out of cows' horns, and a cotton factory with 1,000 spindles and looms. There were so many different mills and works that the race couldn't turn all the wheels. The Sentinel came around every day but Sunday. Nobody but an idle person had time to read it any more. Down on Water Street, the Grand Central Hotel had fixed itself up like Babylon, with carpets all through, and the Mechanics' Society had started telling plant and shop owners what they could do and couldn't. Don't mind her, she heard Jenny tell Deasia. It's finding your Aunt Sully that way that done it. It's eating at her heart, and she don't know it. Seward never let on that she heard. It wasn't Sully she felt, but the pride and greed and great shakes of these town bodies that bothered her. Nothing was good enough for them any more. Twice had her own church been rebuilt during her lifetime, and still they had to make it bigger, with a new steeple so high no workman for less than $4 a day would risk his neck on it. The select men weren't satisfied any more with fire ladders in the market house, and fire buckets of harness leather with the householders' names painted on them. No, they had to send for a Philadelphia fire engine and fetch it all the way around by New Orleans. This engine had a water tank you filled with buckets, and a crank to pump it out. Oh, fighting demon fire was a good thing, and Seward stood high on the subscription list for both ladders and engine. But even this grand new engine didn't suit them long, and now they had to have one that sucked up water from a well or cistern. They called it the Neptune, and another company was starting the Vigilance. That wasn't half of it. Merchants were spoiling the square, buying up houses and making them over into shops. They even tried to buy the old cemetery and put up a new bank and hardware store on the graves. Nothing could stop progress, they said, not even Miss Wheeler's mother's bones. Seward bowed up her back at that. She told what she thought to Porteous, who let fly a speech about disturbing the last resting place of the pioneers, and that put an end to it, but some of the businessmen were so mad at her, they complained bitterly about her holding on to her lots for raising truck. Land so close in was needed for business to give men a chance to work, they said. "Why don't they say it to my face?" she complained to Porteous. "Then I could give them a piece of my mind. Their houses and mills shut in all my land now. I can't see the country any more. Every way you look, you're stopped by their sod boards, or else their brick and stone." The old order had changed, she told herself. The world she knew was going. About the only thing left around town was the ancient sugar maple halfway across the square. It wasn't much of a tree anymore, and hadn't been for a good while. Once it had given copiously of syrup. Sayward herself had pounded spiles in the butt. Of late years it had been going downhill. The butt had a hollow place big enough for a good-sized bear to hide in. Every winter more limbs had broken off. The crown was dead, and the only green part left was its middle. But that tree had seen her pappy when first he came to this country, and the rest of them as well. Then one night in October it stormed, and when she got up in the morning, the old tree was done. The butt had broken off at the hollow place, and what leaves it had lay yellow and mud-spattered on the ground. "The great God, Pan is dead," Porteous said when he got up and saw it. "Well, it was about time that it came down," Sayward told herself, "before it fell on somebody. She wouldn't want to see it maim one of those young ones, always playing around it. Funny how they seemed drawn to that old tree." Just the same, she didn't sleep so good that night. When she woke up from a nap at daylight, she had the strange notion she lacked something. Now how could you miss something that you never did have? She lay there listening, but couldn't hear anything. When she got up, she looked around the room. Now how could you expect to see or hear anything when you didn't know what it was you looked and listened for? The only thing missing when she went to the window was that sugar maple she used to see, halfway across the square. Already it had been half cut up by Cherry Alley householders. It couldn't be that old tree lying on the ground that bothered her, she told herself. Why, all her life she had hugged herself to see a tree come down. It meant you could see the sun and stars a little better. A mite more light and air could come in. A few more stalks of corn could grow and give meal to hungry young mouths. Why, back in the woods, she and every other settler woman hated the trees like poison. They were your mortal enemy. All your life you had to fight them, chop, split, nigger them off till nothing was left. And then their wild sprouts kept coming up to plague you. Even now, long after the trees were gone, the big butts still lived on in your joints. Heavy lifting and rolling had thickened them till you sometimes felt like an old tree walking. That afternoon, from the third floor she looked out of a front window and later out of the back. Over the whole city hardly a tree could her eyes find. She knew it had some lilac, apple, and peach trees tucked away here and yonder inside and backyards, but they were puny, of no account, could hide behind outhouses. Hardly one could she see from here. The city looked all red brick and wood. Now where had she seen such a city before? Then she knew this was the city she had dreamt about that time long ago in the wilderness, a city of red brick and white wooden church steeples, and never a tree in sight. She had thought it then a wonderful sight to see, a place free of the lonesome gloom of the deep woods, and nary a big butt to have to cut down and burn up. But she didn't know how much she liked it now. It minded her a little today of one of those desert places her father told them about, of red rocks and sand as far as you could see, not a single tree raising itself toward heaven. She couldn't help thinking of some of the trees they had seen on the trip to Indiana, not the kind she had known in the woods, standing thick as thieves, with their heads together, plotting against humans. No, these big butts of the countryside seemed of a different and kindlier breed, standing in open places, free to spread out on all sides, a whole woods of leaves and limbs, hanging on a single trunk. One big basswood she recollected especially. They had seen it first a long ways off across the fields. As they approached, it grew taller and broader, like the daddy of all the big butts, rising halfway to the sky and spreading out like a monster umbrella over canal, towpath, and Loch Tinder's house. It was a hot day in the sun, but when the boat came under the shade, it felt cool, fresh, and green, like when she was a girl in the deep woods. Only this wasn't something fierce, but tame and beneficent to man. She noticed it again when they came back. It was a warm, early September evening. All were on deck to see the sun going down and the moon coming up. They had to wait for another boat to pass through the locks, and then one of the gates had to be patched up. All the time she sat there listening to the soft wind in the big basswood. It stirred like something alive. It was immense and powerful, yet gentle as a woman holding its great arms over water and land, boats and locks, the Loch Tinder's cottage and his children. Now why did she think all her life that trees were savage and cruel, or were they wild in the woods when she was young, and now in the peaceful countryside did they grow tame and sweeter-natured? Or did she make up all this in her mind? Could the leopard change his spots? Maybe she was just homesick for when she was young. All winter she looked at the naked city and square. When the ground first thawed in the early spring, she put a mattocks, shovel, and old axe in the chariot, and had Chauncey drive with her into the country. They crossed the canal on the 6th Street Bridge and drove up the hill. They had to go a long ways before they found what she was after. Once all this country had been thick woods, where she and Maggle Mahon would walk their bounds. Now there were so many houses she couldn't tell any more where her land had ended and Maggle's began. She couldn't even see Maggle's house and barn, far out beyond where Gordon lost his finger. They came on a patch of brush and second growth. The farmer said he wouldn't mind her digging out a few whips. He was going to clear it for corn anyhow as soon as he was able. She picked out 3 young maples, a buckeye, a basswood, and a whitewood poplar. She wished she could bring home a pair of young oak trees, a white oak and a red, but hardly would they stir their stumps during the rest of her lifetime. She also wished she could find an elm like the one that used to lean by the old cabin, but she couldn't tell a young one for sure, its leaves not yet sprouted. Every tree she and Chauncey dug out stood higher and stouter than she did. They had to work a long time to get the roots whole and free, and to do them up in burlap sacks with some of their home soil for company in their new lodging place. They drove back to Americus with the long whips sticking out of the back of the chariot. She had no trouble with the farmer, but she had plenty with Chauncey once she got to town. About all he was good for was holding up the tree while she spread the roots tenderly around and tromped the ground down. The basswood, the whitewood poplar, and one of the maples she planted in her side yard, the buckeye, and the other maples in front of her house, until she finished. A small crowd of folk had gathered to watch. Where did she get them? Did she think they would grow in the city? Where did she get the idea? From her hometown back east? Why didn't she have the city council do it for her? Wouldn't horses and young ones break them down? Well, she intended to have Clem Richter build a cribbing about these 2 on the square. Small news traveled fast, as big in Americus. It was too dark for Porteous to have seen much of anything when he came home, but she could tell the minute he came in that he knew all about it. "I hear you've been improving the property," he mentioned. "Well, I don't know if you'd call it that," she disallowed. "I was always under the distinct impression that you hated trees," he said. Sayward went on silently with her work, getting supper on the table. Now how could she explain to him the reason why she had done this? She didn't altogether know it herself yet, except that once a woodsy, always a woodsy. That might explain it. She saw him watching her all through the meal, and when they were nearly done, she came around to it. "I was just sitting here thinking what Miss Kramer told me," she said. "This was last summer, the last time she came around with her berries. Their church out in Long Swamp Valley burned down, and old Millie Hoffman wanted to know when they were going to build it. You know old Millie, the one that's such an infidel. They asked him, what did he care when they built it? He said he had a good reason. When he looked over from his fields, he missed seeing the steeple. The valley didn't look right to him any more without a church. I guess I'm like old Millie. The town doesn't look right to me without any trees, especially not the square." Chapter 24. Dock Street. "This house is mine, and yet not mine. Another comes, and yet it is not his." Old Illumination. This year the Tenches had to move. Their house, the Clocker house, on one side and the Singleton house on the other, were all going to be torn down and cleaned out for a row of brick houses, they said. Rosa stood very still when she heard the news. Never had she known their dark little box of a house to look golden as now that it had to die. Why, she had been born in that house. all her 17 years had she lived in it. Of course, 6 days a week she went to Miss Doane's, trimming hats with ribbons and bird wings, sometimes taking finished bonnets to the houses of the ladies they were made for. But all the time the little house by the river was home in her mind, and what would she have done without it, and without her mother sitting in the dim room waiting to ask her what had gone on at Miss Doane's today? And now the house was going to be pulled down. Already it belonged to a strange man who cared nothing about it than to destroy it. It gave her the same strange feeling as when her baby sister had died. It was the only sister she ever had. Rosa was just a little tyke at the time, and many a night after that she would wake up in a cold sweat over the dead baby. Nothing then would satisfy her save getting up and taking little Boycie out of the same cradle the baby had died in, making sure he was alive, and then rocking him soft, warm, and living in her arms. Now evenings after work she hurried home, decently as she might, to spend all the time she could in the house, while she still had it with its roof spreading over her, and the four walls standing around her. She was small for her age, and could run all the way home if she wanted to. Nobody save her mother would say aught against it, but her father swore he was glad to get out of Higgins' old house. It's too far from the waterfront, he said. He meant the new waterfront, the canal. I have another place rented. It's bigger than this, with 2 rooms and a goin' business in the front. Turkey can tend it when I'm off. The first day of April was moving day. Rosa stayed home from work to help. Her mother was of small use. Ever since the news came, her mind seemed stopped like a clock. She sat like one too, and you could tell no time from her face. Only the pendulum tassel on her old dress moved, and that faster than Rosa remembered. Sometimes the mat of hair she never let Rosa touch kept in time with the tassel, giving little tremors as if struck by an unseen hammer. On moving day morning she went helplessly from one thing to another. She'd pick up this and couldn't make up her mind what to do with it. So she'd set it down and pick up something else. That's the way it went. Rosa and the boys had to do everything. The wagon came right afternoon to load their stuff. Her father the driver, and the boys carried out the things. The inside of the house grew bare as a nut. Rosa had never seen it look so ugly. "We have to go now, Mama," she said. Across the street she could see a knot of folks waiting. Oh, she knew what they waited for. They wanted to get a look at her mother. Here's where they'd get to see Miss Tench at last. She had never come out of her house since her first child was born, but she'd have to come out now. "Come on, Mama," Rosa said, and went out. But her mother didn't come, and her father and the boys made like they weren't ready to go anyway, rearranging the things in the wagon. Still, she didn't come. "Go in and get her," Rosa's father told her. "She says she'll come right away," Rosa said when she came out. But right away passed, and Jake went in. You could hear his loud voice outside. In the end he came out without her. "Can you wait a little?" he said to the driver. "We'd go and leave her to hell behind, but she can't walk that fur." The driver settled down on his haunches by the front wheel. His face, Rosa thought, didn't seem to have any expression. It was as if this whole business was something that happened long ago and had nothing to do with today. It was time out of mind, out of man's control. The minutes went by as if they pulled hard against the grain. It seemed to Rosa they'd never get away now, and here they'd forever have to stay. Out of the old house, but still not in the new. The loafers licked their lips, watching. The horses stood sleepy and willing. Rosa listened for the tick of the clock laid some place in the wagon, but it must have stopped, like everything else. The driver got up. "Well, I got to go, Jake," he said, and climbed up on the seat. His rough, hairy hand picked up the lines. Boise ran to the door. "Mama, he's a-goin'," he shrilled. Not a sound or stir came from the house. The driver clicked to the horses. They woke from their drowsing. The wheels started to turn. The axles rattled in the hubs. The wagon creaked and lumbered. Then Rosa's mother came hurrying out of the door. She had thrown her brown shawl over her head and shoulders. You could see only part of her face. She looked like a starved bird or fowl peering out of its feathers. Rosa wasn't sure she'd have known her own mother passing her on the street. She looked so different out here in the broad, pitiless light of day. The wagon stopped to wait for her. Rosa ran to help her mother catch it. She and Turkey pushed her up over the wheel to the front seat, where she pulled the brown shawl around her. The driver sat very still, not looking at her, even when she sat up there beside him. Rosa and her father and the boys walked, keeping abreast of the wagon. It reminded her of the baby's funeral. That's the way they had walked to the cemetery, while the cart bumped along with the little coffin. But that had been winter time. Wasn't it nice this spring, the way so many folks were planting trees in the city? Hardly anybody so poor that they couldn't have one or two in front of their house. In 20 years, the streets of Americus would be green with dancing leaves. But where would she be then? The wagon turned off Water Street at 6th. Now why did the driver have to take their poor traps through the fine square? Her mother would hate it if Miss Bogardus looked out and saw her friend go by on the seat of a moving van. Rosa hoped none of the ladies who bought their hats from Miss Doane would see her trapsing with her father and 3 brothers like Country Jake's moving to town. That great plastered white house was where Miss Stowe lived, who had such a lovely slope the way she sat lying back in her carriage when it went by. Next door stood the striped brick mansion house of Judge Wheeler. Farther on the houses got poorer and smaller, one against the other. Then big warehouses and little wooden houses stood together. You could smell the canal down here, with old bones from the soap works and hide scrapings from the tannery. From that brick corner, Mr. Percy Yates, the Yankee, had bought all the anvils in Ohio and made a fortune, running up the price and letting his wife buy the handsomest bonnets Miss Doane could trim. Other rich men had places of business down here. They came only by day. In the evening they went back to their fine houses. but the people that lived here had to stay and breathe the bad smells all night. When the smells got stronger, and when the mills and warehouses stood dark and unfriendly on the street, oh, it had been so open and free around their house by the river, but that life was gone to her now. In an empty log house they passed. Turkey said that a man traveling by canal boat had been murdered. The boys wouldn't walk on the log house sidewalk, but turned into the street. Next came a long stable smelling of canal mules. On beyond, the driver came to a halt in front of a faded red one-story house, hardly more than a shanty. A second shanty with a loft was attached to it in back. The front door stood fastened with a huge iron lock. Over the door letters had been painted in green on the red boards. The Red Mule. Rosa's father took a muddy stone from the street and hammered on the lock till the catch gave. Then he threw the lock on the floor. The boys rushed to be the first in. Rosa followed slowly. She saw that the house had 2 rooms like her father said, but he hadn't said everything. The front room was a rude bar-room with an unpainted plank bar. An empty keg rested on one end of the plank. Behind, on a shaky shelf, stood a row of nearly empty bottles. It didn't seem like a house at all, Rosa thought. Never like their house. The second room was little more of a place to live than the dark hollow of a sycamore shanty. Pieces of glass and pottery, lumps of mud and plaster, drifts of rubbish all lay on the floor. The sour bar-room smell hung as strong in the back room as the front. Even the walls smelled of stale mead and bitters. Rosa wondered what her mother would say when she came in, but she only upbraided them bitterly for not bringing in her chair. When it came, she let herself down in it and sat blind to the swirling dust and dirt around her, deaf to the quarreling where to put this and that. She didn't even want to remember they had moved, Rosa thought. That's the way she kept sitting when Jake and Turkey went out for wet goods, and after dark when the sound of heavy feet and rough voices in the front shook the back room, while the scrape of mugs and glasses and the sharp scent of freshly opened beer and whiskey penetrated under the door and came through the cracks and broken panel. "Come on and go to bed, Mama," Rosa said. "I have it all ready." But her mother wouldn't go to bed, not till the ugly sounds from the front room had ceased, and Rosa's father came stumbling back, yawning and reeking of grog. Then Rosa's mother flew into him. "You disgraced me," she accused. "You brought me down right by his house like any common person in a wagon." Rosa, who hadn't slept a wink in the new house, pondered her words. Now whose house was it her father had brought her mother by? Was it Mr. Millard's, where Miss Bogardus kept house, or the gray stone house of Mr. Percy Yates? Never had Rosa been in Mr. Millard's or Mr. Yates' houses, but once she had been in the old Wheeler cabin, and once almost in the Wheeler mansion house. She wasn't ever supposed to go there. When a Wheeler bonnet was ready, Miss Doane took it herself, but this had been before Easter, and there were always too many bonnets for Miss Doane at Eastertide. She had to work half the night and drink gin to keep her awake in the daytime. She was too unsteady on her feet to go to Judge Wheeler's, so she said Rosa must take the bonnet, but not until late was it finished. If the Wheelers were in bed, Rosa should put it in the usual place, back in the privy, in the box for paper. Then she must close the door tightly. The first one out there would find it on Easter morning. But there was still plenty of light in the Wheeler windows. When Rosa got there, she went around the back way. Miss Desia herself, with a candle in her hand, came to the door. Something flew into her face when she saw Rosa. "I'll take it," she said, and snatched the bonnet. "Good night," she said, and closed the door. Rosa hardly noticed at the moment. In that short space of time that the door was open, she could see like into the golden scene of one of Miss Phillips' novels. It seemed her eyes could run through the whole house. Right before her lay the big wonderful kitchen, with black kettles and shining copper pans. Beyond that, the dim dining room, with the fearfully grand shape of a mahogany clawfoot sideboard. She had a glimpse into still another large room, with soft light streaming from it, and deep tones of a piano, like the sound of water in a blue cavern. It was hardly more than a few moments that the door was open, not a bit longer than Miss Desia could help, but Rosa had seen and heard everything. She could still see and hear it tonight, lying on her bed in the back room of the Red Mule. It was plain as if she stood by the open Wheeler door this minute, and Miss Desia getting ready to slam it on her. On the way home she thought it must have been Chauncey playing, for Miss Byrne would hardly be there so late, and plain old Miss Wheeler, in her knitted cap, could never make such beautiful music. But Miss Bogardus said that Master Chauncey was lazy and good for nothing, and that he liked to fool at the piano, so he wouldn't have to do an honest day's work. Chapter 25. The Off Ox. All of a piece of what they said before. Early sang. Chauncey didn't want to go to the Independence Day celebration in the first place, but he had no idea anything would happen to him there. He only knew he'd feel like a lost sheep at the big gathering. He always did. Most everybody else enjoyed it with an energy and zest that weakened him just to see it. They wouldn't have missed it for the world. They arrived early, and a wild light came into their eyes the minute they got there. They reveled in meeting old friends, in playing old games, in eating old-fashioned rations, and talking and praising old-fashioned customs, in which, try as he might, Chauncey could see nothing except a harder way to live and do things. What made people like that? Why did they want to leave the brighter present for the dark and painful past? Take today. The highlight of the celebration was a cabin raising. There was utterly no use for it, as far as Chauncey could see. It was just to show the younger generation, and especially city folks, how they used to put up a house in the old days, in the woods. They had to go to a great deal of trouble for the event. Logs had to be bought far up the country, boated down the canal, and hauled to the scene by ox team. No timber was left standing around Americus anymore. The settlers and sawmill people had cut it all down. There wasn't even a grove left to hold the celebration in. only patches of scrub overgrown with brush. So the last few years after decorating the graves, the people went to Brown's pasture where the fairs and circuses came. The worst of it was that Chauncey had to take part in the raising. There must have been 1,000 other sons of the pioneers who would have jumped at the chance. The trouble was, they didn't have Judge Wheeler for a father. All Chauncey wanted was to be left alone, and yet he had to get right out in front of the crowd and help carry logs to the end men. The committee was a little simple-minded, Chauncey thought. Indeed, he felt sure all pioneers were more or less simple, almost like children. More than once he had noticed it in his mother. She could be hard as hickory, denying him some small thing he wanted to do, but let somebody tell her a noble story of old times, and water would be liable to run from her eye, like the story she told of the boy in Dark County who had no boots. In the winter-time he'd warm 2 boards by the fire, run out in the snow, and stand on them in his bare feet while he chopped firewood. Any grown-up moved by that story was a little pathetic, Chauncey told himself. But then all pioneers were a little that way. Take these Revolutionary and Indian War veterans, brought in carriages, and who now sat in a place of honor to review the cabin raising. It was hard to believe that these ancient and tottery old codgers had ever fought the British or Indians in the primeval forest. Why, they didn't look as if they could find their way in the woods, let alone outsmart war-whooping savages, doddering, palisade, or half-blinded. They sat on the platform like they hardly knew what was going on. When the veterans of 1812 fired a salute, Major Phillips, who was deaf as a post, got up and squeaked, "I can't hear your volley, men, but your powder smells good." That was the kind of partner Chauncey had the luck to draw for the raising, a little dried-up fellow named McNulty with bandy legs. He looked 100 years old beside the boy. Youth and age, Chauncey's father called them. He was master of ceremonies. "The first ox team will now stand at their yokes," he called out, and Chauncey and 5 other men took their places, where 3 hand spikes had been laid on the ground, and a log rolled on them. Chauncey was at the last hand spike. He reached down to take hold, but he could hardly get his fingers under the iron, and when he tried to pull it up, it felt like his end had been spiked to the ground. He glanced over at Mr. McNulty, but that little shriveled old man had his end up already, and no matter how Chauncey heaved, Mr. McNulty's side stayed so much higher that the log kept sliding against the boy's fingers. "Let me give you a little more hand spike, boy," the old man croaked. "No, sir, I got all I can carry now," Chauncey shouted to make his partner hear. The older settlers had a good laugh over that. "He's got all the hand spike he can carry now," they said. "Your off-ox is a calf, Judge," a Tateville Democrat bellowed. Chauncey felt his face burn. Oh, he lifted his share from then on. He vowed he'd raise his end if it tore him apart inside. If that little old dried-up runt with 1 foot in the grave could do it, he could. He kept telling himself, "He did it too. Now, what did you think folks would give him credit for that, and forget what he said?" But no, they wouldn't let him rest. That little old devil Macnulty was the worst. His nose and chin came mighty close together, but they'd spread apart with glee every time they went back for another log. Some more handspike, Chauncey, he'd twit him. As soon as his stint was over, Chauncey tried to melt away in the crowd, but wherever he went, folks recognized him and grinned. His father wouldn't look in his direction, and he daren't meet his mother's eye. Libby, when she saw him, told him out in front of everybody that maybe now he'd take the powders that Harry had given him. But the worst was the silent pity from Sooth's brown eyes. He felt relieved that Kinsey was away in the Navy and Huldah in Cincinnati, soon to go to England to stay. The only one of the family Chauncey wished for was Guerdon. Good old Guerdon would have stood up for him. He'd have knocked down the man who called his younger brother a calf. But Guerdon was so long swallowed up by the world that at times he seemed to Chauncey like somebody he had once read about in a book. From across the field he heard the quavering voices of the old soldier singing Sinclair's defeat. 'Twas November the 4th in a year that is done. We had a sore engagement near to Fort Jefferson. Sinclair was our commander, which may be remembered, for there we left 900 men in Western Territory. All afternoon Chauncey had to listen to the pioneer singing and storytelling. Their theme was ever of hardship and tragedy, of drowning and starving, of mourning and sudden death. Now how could these old people be so pleased and comforted by such dark and terrible tales? They engulfed Chauncey in gloom. He found coming up in him today all the small creeping terror that used to plague him in church, when as a child beside his mother he listened to the long shouted sermons on dying and being cast into hell. He could always see hell plain as if he was there, the deep red pits, the brimstone flames, and waist deep in them the poor naked people he had known in life, now repentant, but too late. Their clothes were burned off, but their bodies could never be consumed, for that would be unjust to the mercy of God. In hell they must stay, not this year and next, but forever, crying for mercy, getting not even a drop of water to wet the ends of their tongues. How they could stand it, Chauncey didn't know, for he himself would almost expire in rebellion and sympathy. And yet when he looked up at his mother, there she would sit calm as could be. Only great firmness and peace flowed from her, and she could join in a strong, quiet voice when they sang, "Thee we adore, eternal name, and humbly own to thee. How feeble is our mortal frame, what dying worms are we! Our wasting lives grow shorter still, ourselves we cannot save. Whate'er we do, whate'er we will, we're traveling to the grave." How could she, the little boy would say to himself, and how could all the others, for when he looked around, there the congregation sat undisturbed, singing with a great fervor that had no resemblance to dying worms at all. Even Massie, when she was 12 years old, sewed that awful motto on her sampler and never dropped a stitch. It hung in the hall today. There is an hour when I must die. I do not know how soon, how many children young as I are called to meet their doom. It never bothered Massie, not for a lick, and still didn't. There she was now, in a bunch of young ladies, all 17 or 18, in their good dresses, and yet playing father and son like simple-minded children. You played it in pairs, racing to a mark and back. Each had a switch. On the way over, the son tried to birch the father, and on the way back it was the father's turn if he could reach the son. The girls held up their dresses and ran, switching each other unmercifully and pealing with laughter. Only their silly heartlessness, Chauncey told himself, could make them cheerful in the face of all the gloom, and yet the sounds of their high spirits drew him hungrily closer, too unsuspectingly close, for when Hester Patterson saw him, she put her thumbs to her ears, with her hands out like two flaring horns. "Moo!" she cried. "Moo!" Chauncey withdrew, and with what dignity he could muster while their screaming and howling came after. You'd think his own sister would stick up for him, but he could hear her laughter with the rest. He dreaded meeting the family at breakfast. He hadn't much faith in his mother's philosophy, but one of her expressions came to him. "You'll have to live it down," she used to say. That's what he'd have to do now. Living it down was a harder job than Chauncey looked for. Till it was over, he thought the cure worse than the disease. For 3 weeks he couldn't walk across the square without the back of his scalp twitching, fearing the call, "Moo!" after him. But when July was out, he breathed deeper. The month of his disgrace had been lived through. Perhaps August would be better. His father seemed a little better too. Since the night of the celebration, he had been ill of the gravel, with pleurisy on the side to plague him. The doctors said he had had too much cheer on Independence Day, but Chauncey felt a burdening sense of guilt, although he couldn't tell why. Whenever someone called at the house to ask about him, Chauncey felt himself unaccountably flinch. Callers came from over the county, clients, voters, lawyers, court attendants, canal men, and friends. Some of them stayed for a meal or the night. But outside, Chauncey gave no sign, moving like a sleepwalker through all that went on at the house till Little Turtle came, cutting through his shell to the shrinking and indefensible self within. It was morning when Chauncey walked in the kitchen and found the Indian chief there, journeyed all the way from another state, older now, dressed in white man's clothes. He had become heavy, his rugged face layered in brown fat, but he carried himself with great dignity, and there was still something in his black eyes that struck fear to those remnants of childhood surviving in Chauncey's breast. "Hon, Chauncey, big boy now," Little Turtle smacked his lips as he shook hands. "Good'um not dead. Better that way. Come back from 'em now, bring squaw, help take 'em back to Indian." Chauncey knew he was only joking, and yet a great abhorrence came over him. He could barely bring himself to touch the hand of Little Turtle's squaw. Her hair was greasy, her skin a mass of wrinkles, her expression such that her face seemed a blur, a broad mass of flesh like a buttock, almost devoid of features. She eyed the preparations for dinner greedily, and Chauncey's mother gave her a melon to eat before the meal would be ready. Setting the pail of kitchen slop beside her so she could throw away the seeds, the squaw cut the melon with a knife and drank all the insides, including the seeds, cut off a large piece of melon, stuck it on the point of the knife, then shook it around in the slop and ate it. Little Turtle laughed broadly to cover his pride. The others smiled, but Chauncey couldn't. Just the way she had done it filled him with uneasy loathing. Chauncey's father sent word he'd be down for dinner and stay until the doctor came. He looked like a member of some weak and bloodless race beside the coppery face of the Indian, but was glad to see his old friend. Little Turtle's face glowed like some oaken knot in the fire. Oh, you could see he was pleased, seeing his friend, the white judge again, and especially sitting up to his dining table. To him this was a ceremonial room, with its white cloth, blue china, great sideboard, and mirror hanging there. He carried himself like a Roman senator. Everything had to be just so. With great dignity he tried to instruct his squaw in the use of fork and spoons, but it was no use. Can't do so, he defended her. Squaw good. Never cross like white squaw. White man court too long. Maybe get good wife. Maybe get bad. Bad scold all time. All same, white man must keep 'em. Well, how do Indian? Indian see good squaw. Him go right up. Put two finger like this. Hun. Make two look like one. Squaw know what him mean. Take 'em home. No danger him be cross. Squaw know what him do if be cross. Throw 'em away and get other one. So live happy. Go to heaven. In the parlor after dinner, Little Turtle showed his squaw what a piano was. Make music, he explained. Go toot toot. He turned to Porteous. Him like music. Him father like music. Him fight General Wayne. Say, General Wayne make music. Have big dinner horn. General Wayne dinner horn go toot. Toot here. Go toot toot yonder. Gun crack. Indian whoop. Dinner horn go toot toot. Much music. The Indian woman's face never changed, and Chauncey didn't think she looked like she cared a hoot for music. But Little Turtle went on to praise her. Him Christian, he said. All same like you, go church. All sister brother. One sister get up talk. Talk all night. By and by. Him get tired. Choke sister down. That stop 'em. Make talk. Pray. Sister start sing hymn. Sing loud. Drown 'em out. Nobody hear. Have choke sister another time. Then can talk. Pray sing. You want hear 'em sing. I think that would be very nice, Chauncey's mother said from the doorway. Little Turtle turned to his squaw and urged her in Delaware, encouraging her by singing himself, as you do to start a child. Chauncey didn't recognize a word, but he could make out the air of the doxology. Kain na mu tok ok was, Kaina muwam a kong a ya, Kon nom mu wa kong ka ta lak, Kong nom wa guaz mint wak ujija. The squaw wouldn't join. She only grunted in Delaware. Him want hear you make music, Little Turtle said. Tell her I'm extremely sorry I don't play, Porteous said, courteously. Wife play. No, the only one at home who plays is Chauncey. Him, well glad, can do something. You tell him play. All eyes were on Chauncey. He wished now he had sneaked out after dinner. He never enjoyed playing for anyone, let alone for a heathen Indian, and his squaw who wouldn't know a black key from a white one. I don't know what to play, he protested. Play the Lady of Lottie Polka, Massey suggested. Chauncey shook his head. If he did play, never would it be anything gay and fast, or the Indians might want more. No, if he had to play, it would be something they'd never want to hear again. He'd make it so dismal and sad, they'd be relieved beyond measure to have it done. He went up to the piano and sat for a little. Then he began the harrowing strains of On Nebo's Lonely Mount, or Moses's Funeral March. Before long he was conscious of extraordinary interest behind him. He couldn't look around, but in one of Aunt Munity's mirrors he glimpsed the Indians manifesting unusual excitement. Even the old squaw had become alive and was swaying back and forth on her chair while Little Turtle had to go up on his feet and was doing a kind of dance. The boy couldn't see him continuously, only when he came in range of the glass, at which times he perceived wild and terrifying arms flung over him. When he got to the end of the piece, Chauncey felt considerably relieved. More, make more, Little Turkey shouted, but nothing could have induced Chauncey to play again. I don't know any more, he lied. The Indian was disappointed. Almost at once his animation dropped from him, and he became his old, resolved self. Grim dignity wrapped him like a blanket, and he sat down. But you could see he felt cheated by Chauncey. If can't make so, he grunted. Minds me like story. Indian scout take out white men. Tell how to go. Come on tracks in mud. White men say buffalo track. Scout say maybe no. Maybe Ming take sticks. Make track. Fool white man. Maybe Ming wait ambush scout. White man be careful, go slow, look every bush. White men do so. By and by find dung a buffalo. Indian scout laugh. Now all right, he say. Mingu can't make so. Only buffalo can make so. Minds me like Chauncey here. Only music man make so. Chauncey can't make so. While Chauncey's father was laughing, Dr. Howie came. The boy tried to sneak off, but the doctor caught him. Wait a minute, Chauncey, he said. I want you to recover my other bag from the carriage. The boy went reluctantly for the bulging bag and its evilly clanking contents. Now don't go away, the doctor instructed him. I suspect I am going to need you. Ever since Libby had married young Dr. Harry, Sayward and the children had called him faithfully when ailing. Libby thought her father should have him too, but Porteous said he had had Dr. Howie ever since Dr. Purcell died, that he liked the man and his wit, and felt it an injustice to discriminate against him simply because he was no churchman or son-in-law. Not that he had any prejudices against Harry Conyngham, he went on, who was an estimable and rising young physician. Libby told her mother that her father just wanted his complaints kept secret from the rest of the family, but Chauncey thought he understood why his father liked the ironical Dr. Howie. They were two of a kind. The doctor stood here now, a tall, delicate-appearing man, who nearly always looked nearer death than his patients. He moved delicately, too, like one on his way to heaven, but when he opened his mouth, you knew he had no intention of going there. Nor was he delicate. He liked to say that he would prescribe pills to the goddess Diana and administer psychic to the Vestal Virgins, but the only patient he'd practice phlebotomy on would be a brass monkey. It was too messy. However, today, at the sight of Chief Little Turtle and his squaw, some perverse humor seemed to possess him. It appeared to please him to have savage Indians for an audience, and the judge's grand parlor for a lancing room. Not for a moment did he suggest removal to the kitchen. He helped the judge off with his coat, then rolled up the patient's white shirt sleeves with his own white tapered fingers. Now pleased with himself and the attention, he handed Chauncey a wicked-looking gallipot from the bag and held up half a dozen fierce and bloodthirsty lances to select from. Chauncey had an uncomfortable feeling at the pit of his stomach. "Hold the vessel here," the doctor said dryly, "and don't look so terrified. It's not you I'm going to lance, but your father, and I daren't let him bleed to death, or the bench might forfeit my license." Chauncey bore up, screwing his nerves to the needed pitch, holding the gallipot at the required place. He saw the unhealthy white flesh of his father, with black hairs curling like worms, the cruel curve of the rusty lance, then his father's warm red life's blood gushing out like from a steer's throat at the butcher's. A violent wave of sickness went over him, and the next thing he knew, he was lying on the sofa, with Massey applying cold cloths to his head. Strings of unrecognizable words came from the doctor's mouth, while Chauncey's mother worked with a rag on his blood-stained pantaloons, and Deesia, on her knees, wiped up the floor where the gallipot still lay. Chauncey wanted to scramble up, but his father sternly bade him lie. He had never seen his father so grave and pale. The boy lay there with his eyes closed, every muscle conscious of itself and aquiver. Once he lifted a lid and saw Little Turtle regarding him with contemptuous eyes. Presently the Indian spoke sardonically to his friend. "Long time past, Little Turtle say give 'em Chauncey. Indian make 'em over. Make 'em do what don't like. Make 'em walk in snow. Make 'em sleep on ground. Make 'em man or be with great spirit. Not now, you say. By and by. Now by and by come. What have you? Look like man, eat like man, walk like man, but act like baby. Got pigeon heart. Indian can't make 'em over now. better be with great spirit." Chauncey's father said nothing. The boy still lay rigid, like a prisoner at the scaffold. He heard the doctor go. Then his mother help his father upstairs. Soon as his parents' feet sounded in the upper hall, the boy sprang up and fled. As he snatched his cap from the rack, he could hear little Turtle's hoarse laugh after him. The air outside, when he reached it, was sweet as wild honey. It seemed at that moment that if he drank enough of it, all his troubles would be ended, wiped out of existence. But that he found was only his fancy, for as fast as he outraced his dishonor, it caught up to him in painful humiliation. He fled the square and headed for the waterfront, where fewer would know him. The canal smelled good as he approached it, the scent of stale water and tarry ropes and frying eels, of wood and paint drying in the sun, of mules and down-to-earth manure. The very sight of the district soothed him. The shacks and warehouses, the humble little shops, the muddy street, and all the boats tied up in the basin. The canal had a kind of bay dug out from it for a boat yard. They called it the level. It was another world than the square. Boat carpenters sawed, hammered, pounded with caulking mallets. The hot foreign scent of tar was stronger here. On the decks of condemned boats, men sat fishing. A huge darky fried his fish over a fire of oaken chips, using a shovel for a frying pan. Running wild on the condemned boats, a gang of naked boys played whoop, jumping from boat to boat, hiding between, climbing down into empty holds and cabins, and diving out of open windows into the yellow water. Chauncey sat for a while, with his feet down over the side of an abandoned boat, rocking faintly in the small waves, stirred up by the boys. Then he lay down on the deck. The rocking, the sound of small lapping against the boat, soothed him only for a while. He started to tramp aimlessly again, crossing the lower bridge and back over the next, threading the narrow streets and alleys, his eyes devouring glimpses of strange life through open doors and windows. What he searched for he never knew, till he passed an open door on Dock Street. Above it was painted the Red Mule, and inside he saw Turkey Tench behind the bar. Then he thought he knew. The bitter scent of whiskey and gin flowed like a slow river of air from the door. He had always hated the smell, and the stuff worse, even when diluted with water for himself and others as children. He remembered once they had made him drink rum and milk in the ferry house, and the awful mess he had made over his father on the way home. The clear, persistent pattern of it shook him. Then he was only a child, now he was grown, and yet today he had fainted dead away, defiling himself, his father, the doctor, and the carpet. "How are you, Turk?" "Why, how are you, Mr. Chauncey?" "Will you stake me to a drink? I'll pay you next time I come down." "Why, sure, you'll have all the credit you want." Turkey's look of surprise had not abated. and his small black eyes continued to scan Chauncey's face. "What will you have?" "Brandy." Chauncey heard himself say it like his father. He would drink it if it burned out his throat like a soot fire did a chimney. If he had to drink a second glass to hold the first one down. Turkey poured him half a tumbler full, and Chauncey stared at the thick glass, trying not to smell it. When he lifted it up, it tasted of fire and musty old cellar barrels. He saw Turkey watching him, and the almost imperceptible ebb of the liquor from the glass. After a while, a girl's voice sounded in the back room, and Turkey opened the door between. "Rosa," he called briefly. "Somebody in here, you know." He left the door open and went back to the bar. When Chauncey turned his head again, she was in the doorway, looking extraordinarily slight and sensitive in this uncouth place. So this was where she lived, he told himself. Here, in this waterfront barroom shack. "Rosa, who is it?" Her mother's sharp voice called from the unseen room. She didn't answer. "Rosa, come back here. I want to talk to you," the mother demanded. The girl moved with quiet surety into the tavern to stand with Chauncey at the end of the bar. "Don't mind her," she begged, in that gentle way he remembered. But Chauncey couldn't help minding or feeling for Rosa. She was like he, wronged by the stars, caught in the blind machinations of birth and life. For himself he could do little as yet, but for her he would do a great deal. It made him feel stronger. He could swallow this liquor now. Once he had it down, his mind and tongue began working on all the bitter injustice that had been done him. But before he could bring out half of it, he was stopped by the quick, uncommon shadow on her face. When he looked around, he saw through the open door a group of ladies approaching in the street. In their fine gowns, bonnets, and manners, they looked out of place on the waterfront. They picked their way across Dock Street and formed themselves directly in front of the Red Mule, where they stood meekly enough with open hymn books in their hands as in church. One of them struck a note. Then their voices rose oddly high, pure and mild in this rough place. "Oh, for a heart to praise my God, a heart from sin set free." "A heart that ever feels thy blood, so freely spent for me." "Don't mind them," Chauncey said. It was his turn now to apologize, for these were intruders from his own part of town. His father frowned on the temperance crusaders, but Sooth belonged, joining the group on certain days, helping to besiege some tavern, singing the most reproachful hymns they knew to melt men's hearts. They went summer and winter, knelt in snow or driving rain, to pray aloud for the men inside. Chauncey had often seen them on Water Street. More than once he had stopped amused to listen, but it was less amusing to be caught inside, especially if your own sister happened to be among the besiegers. When the hymn was over, a voice that sounded like Faye's sister, Leah, started to pray for the salvation of the poor souls and sots within. Inside, among these sots themselves, all was interest, respect, and a little perplexity. This was something that had to be handled with care, like walking on eggs or smoking around black powder. The prayer done, Another sacred song was begun. It sounded nearer. "I believe they're coming in," Rosa said. Chauncey looked around for escape. "You can use the back way," she told him, and showed him how to go. He had a passing glimpse of the same sort of dim room as in the other Tench house, along the river, and the same Miss Tench, uncombed and unaged, staring at him like an outraged owl. "Rosa, who is that?" she demanded, but Rosa did not reply. "Wait, I'll go with you," she whispered. At the back door, she threw on a wrap and guided him through several alleys. They came out on the waterfront again, and they stood on a deserted dock, taking up their talk where they had left off, until dusk descended. "I don't want to go home yet," she told him. "Will you walk with me to Butterman's Lock?" Was it he himself and what he had heard, or was it Rosa's mother and what she said? Or why did he have this feeling all evening that he and Rosa were surmounting the world in being together? The canal basin tonight seemed like their inland sea, with a faint mist already rising and making the rows of moored boats on the other side seem very far away. Silent barges lay nearer. A loaded boat was pulling out, the mules moving like shadows along the towpath, the dark hump of a boy on one of their backs. Rosa and Chauncey slowed their pace to keep even with the boat. When it entered the long stretch to Butterman's Lock, the captain's horn called to the lock tender over the isle of dark water. The wild note hung in the air, lingered, trailed off, and came again, like the dying strain of the vanished spirit of the wilderness. "Can you float on it too?" Rosa asked him, "especially in the night time like this. Most every night I lie in bed and close my eyes and go on it wherever I want to, and the longer they draw it out, the farther I can go." It wasn't the boat horn, but themselves that did it, Chauncey told her. The rebellion and liberty that lifted them up, that's what made life tonight richer and wiser than he remembered it. Seldom had he been so aware of the warm, musky scent of the water, the half-moon in it, and all around him the velvet night, including Rosa. Something appeared to flow from her slight body to his. She seemed like someone he had known a long time, longer than his mother or Aunt Jenny, closer than Sooth or even Massey. No one else knew like she did the words he was about to speak, of the troubles and problems that lay on his mind. Sometimes he could tell in advance what she was about to say, but not always. Frequently her fancy rose like the strange killdeer to circle and cry its wild note over water and cloud. Then often he had to go back to childhood to follow, to know what she meant, to a time when he was very young and could stand in a floating leaf and steer it across a mud puddle sea. For a moment, then his feet felt extraordinarily tiny, like the feet of the little old boatman Rosa told him about, who could dance a jig on a dinner plate and never once get off or break it. It was much later when they came back down Dock Street. They had passed the cabin of the Wizard of the Dell, Rosa said. A little farther on, her young arm stopped him. Ahead, in the darkness, stood a house of 1.5 stories with a squat, ugly roof. save for one lonely window. The house was dark. In that window, a woman stood mysteriously, swinging a lantern. Boldly, almost blasphemously, she would bisect the window from top to sill and from corner to corner. Afterward, she would make occult signs and symbols across her head, across her feet, and then around in circles that grew gradually larger or smaller. "They say she's a witch," Rosa whispered. "Something evil is surely going to happen now." Chauncey had never seen anything like it before. He watched with a kind of horrible fascination while the woman performed her secret rites. She seemed to be writing on the night. All she did was a pattern, had to be done exactly right, and when she finished one series, she would remain utterly still and grim on her feet and rest. Then suddenly, almost vengefully, the lantern would start again. Chauncey and Rosa stood a long time watching, while the streaks of light were drawn across the darkness in mysterious design, and while around them the shadows rose and fell with obscure implications.